Hello dear listeners, thanks for taking the time to listen to this introductory video in which I will be giving a general ground plan for a series of close reading videos on Heidegger's published lecture course Basic Questions of Philosophy. Before I go into the philosophical segment of this introduction, I will first introduce myself and a more general goal and scope of the series of videos that I will be publishing in the coming months. The goal of the videos is to present a comprehensive commentary on Heidegger's basic questions of philosophy in the form of closed reading sessions. In these sessions, I will try to interpret and explain the contents of the work. As someone who has been intensively reading and writing on Heidegger's philosophy and phenomenology in general for the past 5 years, I find Basic Questions to be one of the most crucial and accessible works for understanding the essence of Heidegger's philosophy. My interest in Heidegger and from there on phenomenology started during the second year of my bachelor's in philosophy, in which I wrote a paper on Rorty's rejection of truth as objectivity. Rorty mentioned two philosophers as especially groundbreaking and moving towards what he calls edifying philosophy, namely Wittgenstein and Heidegger. After reading the first 50 pages of Being and Time on my own, without having understood a word, I turned to Wittgenstein for a short period. This changed when I encountered Hubert Dreyfus' lecture course on Being and Time. From the first lecture I was fascinated, both by the content and by Dreyfus' teaching style. It would not be an overstatement to say that this lecture course changed my life. Dreyfus' lectures allow me to start reading Heidegger's works on my own and attempt to follow my own path of thinking. This path of thinking led me to do a lot of writing, some of which is available, but of which the bigger part is still being worked on during the hours that I'm not teaching. This close reading series is my attempt to give back what I've learned in a twofold way. First of all, it is meant to give people who are interested in Heidegger's philosophy a place to start, and secondly, to present a detailed interpretation of basic questions so that people who are familiar with Heidegger can hone their and my interpretation by opening a platform for discussion. Additionally, what I found is that there are hardly any videos that take the close reading approach in the form that I'm going to attempt here. Videos on philosophy usually fall into two categories. Either they are short summaries and explanations, or they are full lectures. However, because I believe that learning philosophy is largely done by reading and discussing texts, I feel like something similar to the close reading format is missing. I think neither a summary nor a lecture helps one learn how to read a complicated philosophical text, nor does it get to the heart of developing a thorough interpretation of such a complicated text. It is on both these levels, the understanding of Heidegger's philosophy and the skill of reading and interpreting philosophy, that I hope that this close reading format will be fruitful. It is also for this reason that I have chosen to do the close reading videos in English, even though I do most of my writing in Dutch. This is simply because I want to reach and help as many people as possible, and since doing it in English will not hamper the development of the philosophical ideas, as it does when writing and developing ideas myself, I believe this to be the better choice. So all in all, you just have to bear with me from time to time, as I'm trying my best to get everything across in English as well as possible. For the remainder of this introductory video, I'll be giving an overview of Heidegger's philosophy in general, and afterwards an introduction of basic questions in particular. Martin Heidegger is a German philosopher born in 1889 in Meschede. As part of a Catholic family, he performed an active role within the Catholic Church in Meschede. Related to his active role in the Catholic community where he lived and grew up, he started to study theology in Freiburg in 1909. Before he attended the University of Freiburg, he was first sent to a Catholic school in Constance, and this and all with the goal of becoming a priest. However, after 2 years of studying theology, Heidegger switched to philosophy, and a few years later, in 1915, he also started teaching at Freiburg University. In the same year, Heidegger started teaching in Freiburg. Husserl also took up a post at Freiburg University. Husserl would, in years to come, be a very important figure in the development of Heidegger's own thinking. Even though Heidegger did not follow Husserl's thought completely, the phenomenological reduction that Husserl developed as the main methodological starting point of phenomenology, of which I will say more in a minute, plays a central role throughout Heidegger's philosophy. In the 4 years Heidegger worked as Husserl's assistant, he developed his own take on phenomenology, especially in relation to Greek and medieval thinkers such as Aristotle and Duns Scotus. From 1923 to 1928, Heidegger gave lectures at the University of Marburg. In these lectures, Heidegger attempts to rethink traditional philosophical problems by applying the phenomenological insights that he developed while studying under Husserl. 2 key lectures from this period are The History of the Concept of Time and Basic Problems of Phenomenology. In these lectures, most of the key themes of Being and Time, a book usually characterized as Heidegger's magnum opus, are developed in more detail. Heidegger's aim here is to rethink philosophical problems such as truth, meaning, existence, time, and the human being by applying the phenomenological method. In short, one could say that Heidegger believes that the traditional way of dealing with these philosophical questions is unfruitful and that phenomenology is the one philosophical methodology that allows us to go further. With the publication of Being and Time in 1927, Heidegger was granted a chair in Freiburg that Husserl vacated on his retirement, and from 1928 through 1930, Heidegger continued teaching within the scope that he set out in Being and Time. However, somewhere during this period his thought shifts. This is partly due to the many wrong-headed interpretations that Heidegger is confronted with, but mainly because Heidegger experienced that the philosophical, phenomenological approach overshadows key aspects of what he is trying to understand and bring to light. A major work in this shift in Heidegger's thinking can be found in his second magnum opus, The Contributions to Philosophy, which was written during the years of 1936 and 1938, but it was only published in German in 1989. This timeline is important for understanding the lecture course that we will be delving into in this series. The lecture course Basic Questions was given in 1937 and 1938 and is intimately connected with the shift in focus and approach that Heidegger has been working towards since the publication of Being and Time. Before we turn to the last section of this video, in which I'll be explaining the key philosophical concepts needed to understand the philosophical background of the historical overview I've given, I wish to note that we can now see more clearly the importance of engaging with Heidegger's basic questions. In Basic Questions, we find the explanation and application of some of the main motivations and reasons for Heidegger's shift from the purely phenomenological method he employed in Being and Time and get an insight into the development of an alternative method. In the remaining part of this video, I'll be giving an overview of some of the key concepts and ideas that we will need to place Heidegger within the philosophical tradition and be able to begin our way towards understanding his philosophical position. Heidegger should always be understood in relation to his phenomenological commitments, which can be summarized by his interpretation of the phenomenological reduction. The phenomenological reduction plays a central role in the roughly 8-year period around the publication of Being and Time. The main reason for this is that Heidegger believes that all of Western philosophy before him has been in a grip of certain preconceived notions that have hindered a fundamental understanding of the problems that they dealt with. With the phenomenological methodology, Heidegger holds that he has found a way of dealing with philosophical questions so that no external determination taints the answers. The clearest definition that Heidegger gives throughout his work can be found in the Basic Questions of Phenomenology on page 21, in which he writes, "For us, the phenomenological reduction means leading phenomenological vision back from the apprehension of a being, whatever may be the character of that apprehension, to the understanding of the being of this being, projecting upon the way it is unconcealed. This roughly means that the phenomenologist must start with the apprehension of a being, that is, with the understanding of something we experience in the world, and try to uncover how we are able to understand the being as what it shows itself to be. In Dutch, I find that the word for repetition, herhaling, captures the essence of the phenomenological ideal. This is mainly because it contains the word for getting something, besides meaning repetition. In that sense, its scope can be extended to mean a retrieval by repetition. So, by reliving and repeating the apprehension of a being in our experience, we must, without bringing in any external or non-experiential ideas, try to uncover how this being could present itself as the meaningful thing that it shows itself to be. A clear example of the application of the phenomenological method is Heidegger's attempt to show how the Cartesian idea of world is fundamentally short-sighted, found in Being and Time. As a confirmation of my explanation of the reason for accepting the phenomenological method, he writes on page 94 of Being and Time, Descartes does not allow the kind of being of inner-worldly beings to present itself, but rather prescribes the world, so to speak, its true being on the basis of an idea of being, namely being is constant presence, the source of which has not been revealed and the justification of which has not been demonstrated. We find here an example of what I've said about the shortcomings of the Western philosophical tradition, namely that the determination of key philosophical concepts is not received by letting the world and the things speak for themselves. Rather, how and what things are is prescribed and interpreted on the basis of this prescription. Heidegger then goes on to show how and why this is the case for Descartes' ontology of world by showing how Descartes' worldview cannot account for a tantamount of everyday experiences with which everyone is familiar. Descartes writes in the Principles of Philosophy, "We are to consider and to regard as true nothing but the world other than what can be proven mathematically on the basis of the universal concepts of extension, shape, and motion." Now, what this means is that our perception of reality is only true insofar as it corresponds to the abstract mathematical determinations of the beings that we encounter. Additionally, we can only get at reality as it is in itself, insofar as we are able to use our rational soul in order to determine the world in its abstract mathematical being. Everything that does not correspond to the clear and distinct abstraction is merely the result of the tricks that our senses play on us. Think here of a stick that looks bent when it's partially underwater, or the fact that cold water feels warm when one has been in the freezing cold for a period of time. So in short, according to Descartes, the world is nothing but totality of objectively present entities with a calculable size, shape, and speed. Everything else exists only in our imagination. This determination has been the cornerstone of modern Western thinking and is still of great importance for science and philosophy as well. With this summary of Descartes' determination of world, we can now turn to Heidegger's attempt to show phenomenologically how this determination misses the phenomenon of world completely and is, at best, a very shallow and limited determination of beings as a whole. A phenomenon that helps us understand both the phenomenological approach and the shortcomings of Descartes' determination of world is that of distance. Heidegger writes, for instance, "An objectively long path can be shorter than an objectively much shorter path, which is perhaps an onerous one, and strikes one as taking infinitely long. When it strikes one thus, however, the actual world is first truly at hand. The objective distance of objectively present things do not coincide with the remoteness and nearness of what is at hand within the world. The former may be exactly known, but this knowledge is blind. And he says this in Being and Time on page 103. When we apply the phenomenological reduction to the walk I take from the train station to my house, and, in doing so, take nothing but the experience of the walk for itself, I discover that the experience of the distance of the same walk varies from time to time. When I'm carrying more luggage and it's raining, it feels like the time it takes to get to the station is longer than when it is sunny and I'm lightly packed. Another, maybe even more striking phenomenon is the fact that my glasses, even though they are about as close as a being can get, are phenomenologically farther away than the traffic light that I'm waiting in front while walking to the station. I do not notice my glasses at all, while I immediately notice the traffic light changing from red to green so I can continue my way to the station. The objective distance of the walk and between me, my glasses and the traffic light in no way bears on the phenomenological distance that expresses my involvement with these beings. This is because the objective measurement in no way explains the experiential differences in distance. Thus, the world shows itself first of all not in its objective qualities. It strikes us according to the meaningful way we are occupied within the world, and any attempt to do away with this level of experience is a denial of the initial and original way every human being is actively involved within the world. This does not mean that the objective calculations are untrue. There is an objective distance between objects. However, these quantifications are only an abstraction of the more original lived world in which we deal with our surroundings in a meaningful way. If we take away every phenomenological meaningful experience of the world, there would be no way of understanding the distance between two beings as far or short, since these are meaningful determinations that only exist within a world in which distance can be experienced and uncovered. So, by starting with an everyday experience of distance and taking nothing but this experience as the basis for understanding the phenomenon of distance, Heidegger believes that he is able to show how the Cartesian understanding of the world misses or denies a more original level of worldhood, a meaningful experiential level in which the world shows itself in relation to our dealings with it. The denial of this level of experience is motivated by a preconceived goal, namely to present an objective mathematical basis for the further development of the sciences. For this reason, the phenomenon of world has been marginalized as a subjective and unreliable level of experience that should be ignored. With the neutral starting point of phenomenology, we can begin to see how all meaningful experiences of the world start from an everyday involvement that does not coincide with the abstract mathematical quantification through which science understands the world. It is important to understand Heidegger's phenomenological starting point because this is intimately connected with Heidegger's rethinking of the concept of truth that will be a crucial theme in Basic Questions. Descartes' determination of world houses the determination of truth as objectivity and certainty, because a statement is true when it corresponds to the objectively present beings that the statement is about. For example, a statement about the distance between my house and the train station is true when the distance expressed in the statement is exactly the same as the actual distance. Once we accept the phenomenological reduction, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that allows us to determine the objective distance between my house and the train station? This is actually a quite complex task, since we need to know the relative positions of my house and the station, we need to know how to use different kinds of equipment to measure the distance, and how this is related to the practice of measuring distances. The understanding of the task and the practices required to fulfill it now show themselves as the prerequisites for making a correct assertion about the distance between my house and the train station. Consequently, making a correct assertion requires that what the assertion is about is made visible. Without the understanding of the right practices, the world would stay hidden and no assertions could be made about it whatsoever. This level of truth, namely the level that allows one to understand and deal with the world, is what Heidegger calls unconcealedness. In short, truth as correctness requires that the world is unconcealed before a correct assertion can be made about it. Truth as unconcealedness, in Greek aletheia, is the central theme of basic questions of philosophy, and even though Heidegger has in 1937 already shifted away from his phenomenological method, it is still of great importance to understand the phenomenological considerations that lay beneath the surface. When Heidegger talks and thinks about truth, it is always as an active principle deeply connected with the relation between man and world. Truth as aletheia can also be expressed as truth as meaningful presence, and meaningful presence can only be understood in relation to phenomenology, since meaningful presence is the presence of world for man. Very succinctly, one might say that the early Heidegger is interested in how beings in the world show themselves to us as meaningfully present and how we are able to deal with them, while Heidegger in the period of basic questions is interested in what meaningful presence is and how we're able to live in it. Heidegger's shift in focus leads him to adjust his methodology accordingly. He no longer focuses on everyday dealings with beings. Instead, he becomes interested in the way meaningful presence as a whole differs between periods in the history of the West. In basic questions, we see that Heidegger thinks that when we relate to history in the right way, it opens our eyes to the way meaningful presence has been active throughout the history of the West and how our experience and engagement with it changes the possibilities we have going forward. This is vastly different from the phenomenological method, and yet the phenomenological approach is a necessary step in understanding meaningful presence as the essential level through which human beings disclose and deal with the world, of which finding the ground is the scope of basic questions. With this, I would like to conclude the general introduction of Heidegger and the preliminary explanation of some of the central ideas that help to understand the aims and scope of basic questions. Of course, much more can be said, but the idea is to do this once we come across passages that require it, so that I can relate my explanation to the passage in more detail than I can in this format. What I want everyone to take away from this is that Heidegger's philosophy cannot be understood without the phenomenological reduction, which is the methodological approach of starting from everyday experiences and determining how these experiences are possible without bringing in any external determinations. Furthermore, the phenomenological approach shows that the world is first of all totality of meaningful beings determined in their relation to our dealings with them. And lastly, phenomenology helps us see that something can only be said to be true when that which is spoken about shows itself. This self-showing is what Heidegger is interested in and will be the main theme of the lecture course that we will read together. Thank you for listening and taking the time to engage with this difficult material. If you have any questions, feel free to comment or email me.